Millions of people are paying the price for something most of them have never even thought about. Every time you buy a phone, a shirt, a bag of rice, or a cheap pair of shoes, you are standing inside a system that was rebuilt from the ground up by a single idea. A steel box. Not a breakthrough in computers, not a new source of energy, just a standardized container. And yet, that one decision quietly collapsed shipping costs, redrew the map of global manufacturing, elevated entire nations into industrial superpowers, and tied the modern world together so tightly that a delay in one port can ripple into empty shelves thousands of miles away. The strange part is this: nothing about it looked revolutionary at the time. It looked boring, even obvious, but that is exactly what makes its consequences so powerful. Because once the system changed, everything else had to follow, and the effects are still unfolding today. But to understand how something so simple reshaped the global economy, we need to go back to a world that barely resembles the one we live in now. A world before the box. And that world assumed one thing would never change, but that assumption would not survive what happened next. In the early 20th century, global trade moved slowly. Not because ships were slow, but because everything around them was inefficient. Cargo was handled one item at a time. Crates, barrels, bags, boxes of all shapes and sizes. Each one had to be loaded manually by dock workers in a process known as break bulk shipping. A single ship might spend days, and sometimes weeks, just being loaded or unloaded. Ports were chaotic ecosystems of labor, negotiation, and delay. In places like the Port of New York and New Jersey or Liverpool, entire neighborhoods depended on dock labor jobs, but the system was fragile. Slow loading meant expensive shipping. Expensive shipping meant most goods simply did not move internationally unless they were extremely valuable or impossible to produce locally. Globalization, as we know it today, did not exist. Most countries still produced most of what they consumed. Trade was limited, expensive, and unpredictable, and businesses built their strategies around that reality. Factories were close to consumers, supply chains were short, and no one seriously believed that manufacturing would ever move thousands of miles away from consumption on a massive scale, because the cost made it impossible. But that assumption would not survive what happened next. After the Second World War, global trade began to grow again, but the bottleneck remained unchanged: loading and unloading cargo. This is where a trucking entrepreneur named Malcolm McLean entered the story. McLean wasn't a shipping theorist. He ran a trucking company in the United States, and he was frustrated by something simple. Trucks could move goods quickly across land. Ships could move goods cheaply across oceans. But transferring goods between the two was painfully inefficient. So he asked a radical question: what if the cargo itself never had to be touched? What if goods were packed into a single standardized steel box, and that box was moved directly from truck to ship to train without being unpacked? In 1956, that idea became reality. The first standardized container shipment sailed aboard the converted tanker SS Ideal X. At the time, experts saw it as an experiment. They expected small efficiency gains, faster loading, less theft, slight cost reduction. But what they did not expect was that this system would begin to erase the economic geography of the world. Because if cargo no longer needed to be unpacked, ports no longer needed massive labor forces, and if ports became faster, shipping became cheaper. And if shipping became cheaper, everything else would eventually move. But this was only the first domino. At first, the change looked modest. Loading times dropped from days to hours. Cargo theft decreased dramatically because sealed containers were harder to tamper with. Ships began spending more time at sea and less time in port. But the real shift was cost. Within a few decades, containerization reduced the cost of shipping goods by more than 90% in some routes. That number changed everything, because suddenly, distance stopped being a major economic barrier. Factories no longer needed to be near consumers. They only needed to be near cheap labor and efficient ports. The first major relocation began in textiles and light manufacturing. By the 1970s and 1980s, production started moving across the Pacific in large volumes. Countries with lower labor costs became more competitive almost overnight, and then came the most important shift of all. China's economic reforms in the late 1970s opened the door to global manufacturing on an unprecedented scale. By the early 2000s, China was becoming the factory of the world, producing everything from electronics to clothing to industrial machinery. Container shipping made this possible not by one decision, but by removing friction at every step of the supply chain. A single standardized container could be packed in Shenzhen, loaded onto a ship, unloaded in Los Angeles, placed on a truck, and delivered to a store, without ever being unpacked in between. But that efficiency created a deeper dependency. Because when production spreads across continents, the world becomes interconnected in ways that are difficult to see until something breaks. And that is where the real cost began. As global supply chains expanded, efficiency increased, but resilience decreased. Companies reduced inventory to save money. Factories specialized more narrowly to increase output. And entire industries began operating on just-in-time delivery systems, assuming goods would always arrive when needed. For consumers, this created an era of unprecedented affordability. Electronics became cheaper, clothing became cheaper. Everyday goods became widely accessible across much of the world. But behind that convenience was a fragile network stretched across oceans. Because when a disruption occurs in one part of the system, the effects travel instantly. A port delay in East Asia can lead to shortages in Europe. A shipping bottleneck can increase inflation in multiple continents. And a single blocked canal or congested harbor can ripple through global markets. This became especially visible during modern disruptions, when shipping delays caused price spikes in energy, food, and manufactured goods almost everywhere at once. The world had optimized for efficiency, but not for shock absorption. And the more efficient the system became, the more sensitive it grew to disruption. For everyday people, this shows up in subtle but powerful ways. Higher grocery prices, longer delivery times, shortages of electronics, rising transportation costs embedded in almost every product. And all of it traces back, in part, to a system built around the humble steel container. And the effects did not stop there. The shipping container did not reshape the world because it was dramatic. It reshaped the world because it was simple. It solved a narrow problem: how to move goods efficiently between truck, ship, and train. But in doing so, it rewired global economics. Most of the time, history does not turn on sudden catastrophes. It turns on decisions that appear reasonable, efficient, and even unremarkable at the time. Standardization made trade easier. Easier trade made distance irrelevant. Irrelevant distance made global manufacturing possible. And global manufacturing reshaped political and economic power across continents. The greatest transformation was not just industrial, it was structural. Countries became interdependent in ways that were invisible day to day, but absolute when tested. And that is the key lesson. The most powerful systems in the world are often not built through grand design. They emerge from small improvements that scale beyond their original intent. Today, every global supply chain still carries the legacy of that decision made in 1956. And every time goods move across oceans in identical steel boxes, the same system continues to shape prices, economies, and daily life, not loudly, but continuously. If you found this story valuable, please like this video and subscribe channel for more deep dives into the decisions and consequences that shape our world. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Because history rarely repeats itself exactly, but its consequences always find a way to return in new forms.